Hello and welcome back to Let's Chill, the official, unofficial Minnesota Wind Chill, Minnesota Strike, and Minnesota Ultimate podcast. I'm Jeff,
And I'm Jay.
and as you can see, we're in person today. We got a little Memorial Day weekend celebration, so we're without Kane, but we're here in person. Um, Today we are covering two Minnesota Wind Chill games, a win and a loss. You want to get right into it? Let's cover the Detroit game first. Minnesota had a pretty strong game against Detroit. They beat them 25-17, and it was pretty much a typical Winchell Detroit game. Do you think? Or
Other than they started off a little bit slower, they only outscored Detroit by 2 in the first half. And I think we were kind of all expecting them to go out and like show some real fortitude, like really just dominate in the first half. But they just played a kind of a slow game, and they got an easy early lead, and then just kind of expanded on it from there. But other than that, yeah, I thought it was a pretty typical Minnesota Detroit game.
I think both games this weekend were interesting because the Winchell were without a bunch of their star players. They didn't have Abe Coffin. They didn't have Jason Cheetah, Quinn Snyder, or Marco Dragni, right? So each of their lines just looked different, and that's a lot of their offensive players. And this year, I think their offense is supposed to be one of their strong suits, right? So like they really had to kind of play a different game in Detroit and in Chicago.
Yeah, and I'm hoping at least that the reason my Abe Coffin was gone this week wasn't because of the injury that he had, that he left the game early against the Thunderbirds. I'm
Mm-hmm.
hoping that that wasn't the case. Um, but yeah, it looked the team did look different, but it was really interesting to see a lot of these new faces and just like watch them all play and like see how good they all did in that game against Detroit.
Yeah, it was interesting. So we have a list of players who really kind of stood out in Detroit. Tristan Van de Mortel actually this whole weekend kind of had his opportunity to shine. It was cool. Like he's always kind of been a pretty good supportive player. He's always made a name for himself. But this weekend he played some of the most points in the whole among the whole team. He really stood out. He had the second most assists, and the most points played in the game against Detroit. So that really I think was cool to see. And that worked well with some of the other newer players. Again, the second line, third line players who maybe were practice players and got to play this weekend, was that's cool to see.
Yeah, I know. I think we have it here that Cameron Lacey had 3 blocks and he had like a ton of playing time. Like he actually got to be out on the field, be out playing, and he turned up big for Minnesota in that game against Detroit.
Yeah, that's right. And again, Cameron, I know that's who is teammates with Kane, right? On his like pickup team, I think.
I think
I
so.
think so. So Cameron, man, if you're listening, glad you got some playing time and racked up those blocks and got an assist too. That's cool. And then, of course, this player stood out to me. I'm going to be honest. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Matej Petrovic, I believe is how you say it. I don't know if you've seen on the Windchill Instagram, but every time he's listed on like their roster or like they put out like the weekend roster, he's got a lot of fans or friends or whatever who always comment, "Oh, number 25, number 25, can't wait to see you play." So like he got a goal and maybe got a couple goals and assists this weekend, but I saw one of his goals against Detroit and I just started laughing because it's like, yeah, that guy, like he's on my radar now. So that was kind of funny to see, kind of a meme.
Yeah, also it was really nice to see Jordan Taylor, like, especially in the game against Detroit again. Um, Jordan Taylor was just out there. A player we don't get to see much of,
Yeah.
and it looked like, he could have been a Minnesota starter. He was playing that well, and
Yep.
I think there are just a ton of guys who don't normally don't get a ton of playing time who really showed this weekend like they have earned this playing time, that they could definitely be put in more frequently.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think Jordan Taylor has had, I think this year a lot more playing time. Yeah, maybe in seasons past, but yeah, this year I think he's been able to again make a name for himself, solidify his role on the team, and yeah, this weekend I think the team really looked to him to see, okay, you're going to be the main player now instead of the supporter, and that was a good test, and I think he passed the test.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's kind of funny. I think you were watching the game more than I was at the Detroit game, and you kept texting about like it just it kind of looked like they were playing like a pickup game, right? Like Josh Klein.
The way I think he threw two 60-yard plus hucks for two, both to Bivon, both for scores. Like just
That's hilarious.
sent that disc.
Yeah, that's
It
hilarious.
was awesome to watch.
That is fun, and like I think they were just having a good time, and yeah, like when you're getting ready for a game against Chicago, like you can have a little fun, play the players who might not get as much playing time, conserve that energy, and prepare for a game in Chicago the next day. And they had a tough weekend. Chicago also had a game on Saturday in Madison. Um, and Chicago beat Madison, but it was kind of an ugly game. Like we can kind of transition now to the Chicago game. Like I think Chicago has kind of after this weekend further proven and solidified like their role in the Central Division. Like we were kind of talking about like their dominance, and they still are a team to contend with. They are not a force to be reckoned with, I think, or they are a force. They are a force to be reckoned with, and that was proven in their game against Madison and against Minnesota tonight.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I watched a lot of their game against Madison,
mm-hmm.
and I mean, there were just a lot of ugly throwaways, both for Madison and Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And like watching that game, it kind of felt like who wants to lose more. Watching it, that's kind of what it felt like.
Yeah.
But tonight, it just felt like Chicago wasn't playing like that against the Chill. It was like we got that all out of our system. Where tonight we're playing like a cohesive offensive line, and like Minnesota got like 4 breaks in a row at one point. Like their defense really showed up, but I think Chicago's offense just was ready for Minnesota today, and their defense was just ready for Minnesota today, and they were prepared after all that jitters yesterday. And I think playing against Madison yesterday and getting all of that stuff out versus Minnesota was playing against a bit of an easier opponent yesterday and didn't necessarily get to work out those kinks going into this weekend.
That's always the question, right? Of like, okay, we have an easier opponent, so we're going to be more well rested maybe, but then and then Chicago had a tougher opponent, so we're going to be more practiced and more into it. And so then it's like, oh, are they going to be more tired? And you never know how it's going to shake out. An easier opponent the day before or a tougher opponent, which one's going to make you better the next day? And at least for Chicago, yeah, like you said, they figured out the kinks. They cleaned up their game, their offense, and their defense shut Minnesota down and took advantage of a lot of Minnesota offensive mistakes. I think they only had like a 23% offensive efficiency. And just a lot of throwaways, especially early on, and that just dug them into this quick, I think like 4-0, 5-0 deficit right to start the game.
Yeah.
Like
it was really ugly to start the game. And I do think a lot of it was Minnesota's offense just playing a little bit too fast because not necessarily too fast, but just like not chilly, They were playing a little bit not chilly.
They're impatient, I think.
Yeah. And I think when they slowed down and they started like taking that deep breath and they just started making sure their dump passes were online, making sure the transition from cutter back to handler was clean and not just giving up a turnover. And I think once they started doing that, they started to figure out Chicago's defense, which, I mean, to be fair, Chicago's defense probably also was a big reason why they had a lot of throwaways, that tight, that zone to tight coverage, which is what they were doing against Madison all day yesterday. I mean, it was much cleaner today than it was yesterday, but yesterday it forced a lot of turns, and it did today too. When you don't have, you have 7 seconds, you got to get rid of that disc. If there's no one open, you just got to throw it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And like, I think we had this discussion like every single podcast, but like it's just bears worth discussing over time. Is like offense or defense, which wins games, which loses games, and like I think Minnesota's offense really did lose them the game, like with their poor conversion rates, their poor and the tight defense right on Chicago's side. Like they couldn't break the defense, and so then they gave up the disc. But when Minnesota was able to get some break points, they had like 4 break points in a row. That like they were able to work their way back a little bit, but they never quite caught up to Chicago.
Yeah, I mean Minnesota's defense once again just standing up and saying like we're not, like our offense might not be doing it, but our defense always stands up and says like nope, we're not going to let this game go by easily. Right. You put our defense on the field and they're always going to be making those plays, always going to be going for those. Those conversions and everything.
Right. I noticed before the podcast, I checked the player stats, and like overall, not a single player really stood out. Like there's pretty much every player had like 2 assists, 2 goals, 2 blocks. Like no one really stood out stat wise, but I noticed Sam Berglund and Dylan DeClercq, so 2 defensive players, had the most points played, which makes sense when your defense is always on. Well, I guess but I mean, I lost my thought, but they had the most points played.
Yeah.
And they made a significant impact in the game. And again, yeah, when they're on the field, Minnesota's pretty strong, and they again fought back, just couldn't quite keep up. It was too little, too late.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why Sam Berglund and Dylan DeClercq had that most points played is because not only that defensive starting line, they're also the part of the O prime line. When O line gets broken, the O prime line goes on. I think both of them are part of that. And yeah, I mean like Sam Berglund and Dylan DeClercq are both excellent examples of players who, this year, I mean, Berglund's first year on the team, right? Mm-hmm. He's doing fantastic. He's doing great stuff. And in other games, we had seen him shining. He'd have
Right.
great pulls, he'd have great assists, great defensive plays, and this game it just kind of felt like he was present. He was there, but he
Yeah.
wasn't the all-star that we had been seeing in the past few games.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that was because he was not warmed up, if he was just a little tired from yesterday. I don't.
Right.
It was hard to say watching the game what the issue was
Right.
with the players, what was in their heads, what was happening, and I think they just kind of snowballed, and that we got to look towards next week, onward.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like they play Chicago again in Minnesota next week, and I don't know what their roster is going to look like, but I think if they had their full roster, even if they take away Abe Coffin, let's assume that he has an injury, let's assume he's out. If you get back Marco Dragni, if you get back Jason Cheetah and Quinn Snyder, like I think they become way stronger on offense, and I think that they take the dub in Minnesota against Chicago again. So
yeah, and I'm just, interested why Will Brandt hasn't been playing, because
I think he had there's a college championships this weekend.
okay.
Yeah, a bunch of their players were out. I know that's where like PK is, I believe, and a bunch of players are out for other reasons too. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I know, Will Brandt in the one game he's played this far this season had those 4 assists.
Yeah.
And like we expected him to step up into that bigger role. That's what he wanted to do, and then he really did in that first week.
Yeah.
So it's been kind of like a little disheartening to not see him back and not on the line.
And that's a tricky thing. Like we've got a young team, and that's the drawback with a young team is that they've got college still. They have other clubs that they're committed to, and U24 is coming up, so we're not going to see PK for a while. Like so, young team is really good and exciting, but then it leaves a lot of holes for big games like this. So we'll see what they can do against Chicago in Minnesota next week, and where we go from here. So we're looking forward to seeing that. Follow along on Instagram, on Twitter, YouTube, of course, and Spotify. And of course, don't forget to stay chilly and ka-chow.
This episode is presented by the R1P1 Network.